Good morning, everyone. We want to thank Mazna and everybody for having us here and giving us the opportunity to kind of talk about Reef and give you a nice in-person live session of Reef therapy. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. So we wanted to just kind of do a snapshot of the Reef aquarium hobby today. You know, you've probably noticed a lot of things rapidly changing and moving in the livestock space and the equipment space. So yeah, that's going to be our discussion.
Yeah, and I think we want to start off just, I guess, you know, for us to have done it for so long. I mean, I think I set up my first reef tank in '95. I mean, I was, pretty young, but why do we still do it? You know, what is it about the hobby that's still fun after 20 years? Definitely seen a lot of hobbyists come and go. And when you asked me that question as a potential starter question, I was kind of stumped about it because I, when I really thought about it, I don't know why, but then I think I went further and further. You know, when you ask yourself a why question, then that draws another why question, and finally it all kind of boiled down to when, at least for me when I was a kid, if I see a puddle of water, I want to see what the hell's in it, right? Or a lake or a pond. Like, I'm always walking up to the shore. I know probably a lot of you are like that too. You want to see what the hell's living in there. And that is still true today. I mean, I'm, 45 years old, and if I see a pond, I got to go look at it and see what the hell's, going on in it. And so I guess the best answer for me while I still do it is having a big glass box of water in my house with stuff growing in it still, I think, appeals to that side of things, right? I still want to see what's going on in that tank. And then, of course, to be able to curate it and control what was in it, that doesn't go away. So kind of a abstract answer, but honestly, I think that's why I still enjoy the hobby,
I think when I was, about 10 to 15 years in, I would ask myself all the time, like, why am I setting up all these aquariums? Why am I compelled to nurture all this aquatic life? There's not really a great rhyme or reason. That, a lot of you guys have probably been keeping aquariums for some amount of time, but if you just detach yourself and just kind of step outside yourself and consider what it is you're doing, it's kind of crazy. Right? How much effort and how much we do for our animals. There's not really an end goal. You can't eat it. Obviously some people are making a living at it, but that's supported by legions and millions of people who are just compelled to keep aquariums, freshwater, saltwater, reef. We don't want to be like completely critical. That's why I want to start off on a little bit of a lighter note. But for me, and I think Mark will definitely agree on this, is one of the things that we really still love about our aquariums are the stories that are attached to the corals, especially the corals, because they're somewhat fundamentally like immortal if you keep cutting them and fragging them and sharing them. So when I just got to his house, saw his tank a couple of days ago, he had a chalice coral that him and I bought at Cappuccino Bay Aquarium 18 years ago, and I had it for a long time, and he had it for a long time. I lost it, but now he still has some, so I'm going to get it back. And there's just this awesome circular path for these corals in our care, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where the corals have a story attached to their name, to their discovery, and it's just really awesome to share those corals and see what they do in somebody else's tank. And it's crazy sometimes when I look at some of my old videos and photos from my tanks, I'll be watching a video of a tank from 13 years ago, and I'll look at it and I still have that coral. I still have it. And I'll just go over and be like, man, you've been around. You've been with me for so long.
Yeah, I just had to get rid of a leather coral that, I don't know, maybe best estimate, it got about 18 inches wide. I had trouble getting it into a 5-gallon bucket. And somebody asked me, well, how old is that coral? And, I'm glad I uploaded every digital picture I ever had into, the Apple iCloud iPhotos, because you could just scroll back, and I'm like, okay, all right. Oh, I still see the coral. And I think best guess was I bought it in 2005, but I would, I don't keep a log book on that stuff. So it's kind of fun to always go back and see your old tanks and realize that, you know, that one coral you have sitting in the corner, you've actually had a lot longer than you think. It's just you keep swapping out tanks.
You've had them longer than your kids.
Yeah, I've got, yeah, like that clownfish that we bought, I think on that same day. You know, that clownfish is older than my kids and old enough to vote. And so I think that's what keeps you in it too, is that eventually they become your pets. And, you know, are you really going to get rid of a fish you've had for 18 years or, you know?
Another one that I really like, though, is as far as immortal coral strains, is there are certain strains that have names, and we remember when they were introduced. You know, I'll never forget the watermelon alien eye selling on eBay for $400 in like 2001. That was unheard of. And, you know, I do really good with bird's nest, but I don't know why, I have a lot of challenge with the Ponape bird's nest. So every few years I try it again. And so one of the things that, you know, we're not thrilled about is the namings, you know, the naming of the coral names. You know, pick a lane, right? If either we go with some scientific names and use some descriptive adjectives for it, or you pick a strain name and you kind of stick with that. But even the strain names are not being, you know, adhered to. I'm sure you've seen this where, the watermelon alien eye, I've seen it like streaking. A lot of chalice corals over time will actually really morph. You know, the mummy eye is one that will just transform over and over and over. And if you don't have a piece of kind of a more normal, original looking piece of mummy eye, it can be really different. So I'm seeing these old corals that him and I have known for a decade and a half or 2 decades, changing names. And there's a lot of legacy associated with that person, with the tanks they originally grew in, how they look under different varieties of lighting. And so we're losing some of that legacy, but not sticking to the names. And I'm not asking people to get as militant as I am about the scientific names and drilling down to the species, but we want to experience that continuity for another 10 to 20 years, so the next generation can go back and watch videos or dig deep into forums or listen to this session of Reef Therapy and know what specific strains of corals that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, names have to have meaning. And for me, when you take a coral that already had a name with lineage and then you rebrand it, you're hitting the reset button on that lineage. And to me, that might help sell the coral as something new and exciting. But to me, the bigger value is the lineage of the coral itself, right? An Oregon tort, or, I mean, I guess something like a Bali green slimer is a better example. You know, I think a lot of SPS heads have seen that coral. It does get cheaper, right, as more and more people have it and more people propagate it. But the value shouldn't necessarily always be in the price tag. It should be in the history and the lineage of that coral. And you could now rename it as toxic Hulk acro or something, and you just hit the reset button on that coral. I don't really know. I mean, I could probably look at it and say, well, I think that's just the same coral as a green slimer, but for me, I'm not in coral sales, but the lineage of the coral is more valuable to me than, you know, the price of the hot new coral that actually was just the same coral. But
speaking of the green slimer, there's where we're kind of suffering from our own growth from you know, too much of a good thing. There's been so many hobbyists, and so the information is not being you know, kept by some, you know, safekeepers like ourselves and some of the older generations. And so about half of the green slimers out there are not green slimers. Yes, they are staghorn. Yes, they're neon green. Yes, they might have come from Bali, but original green slimer has more of a whitish green tip as it grows. And there's, you know, like half the green slimers out in the world now that are called green slimers that have this orange tip. It's amazing coral, but it doesn't tie back to the legacy of being that first acro that most Americans learned to grow. In Australia, they have a different one. It's called the Dallas acro. And it's like, it is almost exactly, not exactly the same, but same growth, same shape. It's a staghorn. It's almost the same shade of green, but the base color is different. So they have their own legacy analog to the green slimer. And then in Europe, oh my goodness, this is another one, the Milka stylo. That thing has one of, if you've listened to Reef Therapy, I'm sure you've heard us talk about the Milka stylo, but that thing is the only stony coral that we get from the Red Sea. And that was Europe's first SPS coral. And I'm seeing people just completely forget what it is. They won't even do a cursory search. I mean, a pro tip for anyone trying to come up with coral names, just Google it first. Google any kind of combination of that word, because like you mentioned, the Hulk acro. There's so many green acros or green SPS that are called the Hulk, and it's like, man, come on, use a little bit of creativity and originality. So yeah, we're starting to lose some of that, and there was a time when this hobby was a lot more academic based and just really interested in the truth and really interested in what corals actually were. There's a lot of information to be gained from the scientific side of things, right? So not that long ago, well, actually, it's now we're going on 7 or 8 years, what we all called Acan lords. I know it rolls off the tongue. It's a great coral. But when they was redescribed as a micromusa, and then we looked at all the corals we were calling micromusa, we're like, oh my God, that makes all the sense that it does, right? And so now you almost have people pushing back on what the coral is actually classified as. But if you actually collect acanthastrias, like I do, you cannot put an acan next to a lord, because the acanthastria will eat the lord. It will destroy it. And we've seen this several times now with orange lobophilias. Virtually every orange lobophilia is an acanthastria pachycepta. The Australian coral exporters and collectors, they didn't know it was an acanthastria, but they knew that they couldn't put this certain spiny orange lobo with the others, because it would eat them, it would sting them, it would destroy them. So that's kind of some of the practical information that is not being passed along with the name, simply because people refuse to just kind of, learn a couple new names. I'm not asking people to pronounce it super awesome, but man, when you know the coral names, and whether it's strains or the scientific names for the classification, there's a lot of information that is packed in and associated with that name.
Yeah, I think about one of the commenters on one of our shows that we threw up on YouTube was talking about Goniopora, and he ended up with a Goniopora bernardpora, and that's a much different coral than a Stokesi, right? Which is your stereotypical flower pot coral. And so, you've got this aggressive encrusting coral now in your tank, and it's potentially, doing more than you want it to do in your tank. So it's stuff like that where the names still do matter. And I do understand from a vendor standpoint, if everybody's selling acans and you decide to recategorize that category as micromusa, that might sow some confusion for people. But at the same time, and I don't want to get into, I know there's someone talking about the Lacey Act and regulation, and that will be a good talk to listen to. But I think about, one, our relationship with scientific institutions, and science is obviously a very broad term, but then I also think about regulation that's coming. If you think about torch corals and hammer corals, and which ones are actually euphyllias and which ones are not, and if they ban euphyllias, well, what does that actually mean? Things can get really confusing, but I think if we want to combat some of that regulation in a good way and advocate for ourselves, it would help if we knew what we were talking about as well, It's hard to go into an argument and be already misinformed and try to win that argument and convince people that, hey, we're passionate about these corals, we know what the differences are. Here's how your regulation might be a bit broad and heavy-handed. You guys could actually make it a bit more effective. And also, here's a coral that's got a very narrow endemic range, and here's one that's everywhere, So if we ban this coral from this country, but we can still get it from this country, again, it gets tricky, I think, to advocate for ourselves in the hobby when we don't have a good relationship anymore with institutions, because we've gone crazy and we're like coming up with all these crazy Pokemon coral names, and then we don't even quite understand how to argue what they're trying to ban. And And again, I don't want to get off my lawn, but I just remember the days where a lot of the faces in the hobby that we all, kind of worshipped were scientists, right? Randy Holmes Farley, Craig Binman, and we still worship these people. And it's not like they're gone, but and obviously there's been a shift with social media, and there's more of the YouTube personalities and stuff like that. But I just hope that those personalities also just continue to foster that more, again, broad term. I don't know how else to put it, but like that sciencey side of the hobby. And
he's right. It's hard to actually have a linear discussion about this because it's coming in from all sides, right? So at some point, there's going to be a lot more regulation associated with probably everything we do in our lives, not just keeping aquariums. And once upon a time, the pillars of the broader aquarium hobby, especially the reef aquarium hobby, these were, academics and scientists and researchers, and they brought us real, tangible knowledge. Like who here hasn't struggled with parasites and pests and disease? And just in the last few years, a lot of these acro-eating flatworms and monopora-eating nudibranchs, they've been described and redescribed, but they didn't just do that. They categorized the actual life cycles of tagastes on your acropora or acro-eating flatworms on your acros and nudibranch on your montipora. So we're over here, just kind of shooting in the dark, trying to treat some of these coral pests and parasites, but there's these papers that came out, just in the last year or two, and they tell you the exact life cycle of AEFW and Monty nudies. And so that's the kind of academic tools that we need, some real tangible data that will help us break the life cycle of these creatures. And I've tried to bring attention to them on Reef Builders, just in the blog. But without that information, we're just going to be shooting in the dark, trying to eradicate these pests. Right? We're just all happy having, we're not happy, but we're content or resolved to just live with some of these pests and parasites. And I guarantee you, in the future, if you look in the freshwater side of the hobby, almost all the plants that you get for a freshwater tank are tissue cultured, right? So what that means is they've isolated the genetic material of that plant, and they grow in huge numbers, but they're just about as clean as they possibly could be. There's, a little bit of bacteria associated with them, but no pests, no algae, no snails, no anything that you don't want in your tank. And this is absolutely, and it has to be the direction that we go to in the future. At the studio, our biggest challenge is not maintaining alkalinity. It's not, trying to get the right lighting intensity or color spectrum. It's mostly, compatibility between corals as they grow a little bit bigger, and these residual pests. I don't have most of them, but I swear every time I think I've stomped out monopora nudibranchs, they creep back up, and it keeps me from being able to just plant corals wherever I want, because I have to think of which pests are which corals that they're on. And so for sure in the future, my future of the reef aquarium hobby is something close to in vitro corals. And, I'm not expecting actual in vitro corals, but I know that we can get them really clean. And oh my goodness, how much easier would it be to keep a reef if you didn't have to dip, you didn't have to worry about aquarium STDs. I know you guys know, it's sometimes you want to buy that coral, but you don't want to have that vector into your aquarium that's possibly going to jeopardize all the success you've already done. Right? You can get 99% of the way, and you want that last coral, and you bring it in, it's got fish disease or coral disease. But the tools to get past that are absolutely based in science, and those papers are freely available on Google Scholar if you'd only search for them. And so we're making things harder on ourselves by getting further and further away from the scientific roots where this hobby began.
Well, it goes back to, I think you said it once, convenient information spreads quicker. And so, when we want to get more sciencey about something, it's more complicated, and nobody necessarily wants to always deal with that. But it's like the long game versus the short game. The long game, usually has a better outcome, right? I mean, we've talked about other areas beyond just, coral taxonomy, but if somebody comes and asks me, do I need an RODI, right? The easy answer, if you're making a quick YouTube video or you're writing an article, is yes, because even if you've got pristine water, it's not going to hurt you to run an RODI. But if you're living off of a well and you have 500 TDS, then maybe it's not, maybe you definitely do need an RODI. But nobody wants to hear, do I need an RODI? And the person responds, well, it's complicated. I need to ask you 30 more questions before I could give you an answer on that. And that's just a mild example, but I think that convenience factor and just, I just want to give the quick and simple answer also doesn't help, right? I mean, it moves us away, I think, from having a better discussion and solving a lot of the problems. And you see it on the forums where I sometimes think some of these forum posts where people are debating that are 30 pages long is multiple convenient answers arguing with each other. And then you'll get the one guy who writes like a long essay and has some really good ideas in there, and everyone just blows right through that one, right? And so I don't know. I don't know if I was trying to segue a bit off of the naming, but also to try to just say that we need to be, I guess, comfortable with complicated answers, and that, nothing's perfect. And, the coral that you yesterday called an acan is now a micromussa. And then be curious on how does that relationship tie into other corals that it might be more closely related to. Stuff like that. It's just, I just see a lot of easy answers. And I think that's more riddled with landmines than
we're
diving into
we
it.
have the original skeptical reefer here in the house, and you don't get any favors by challenging somebody's position, right? Anytime you just kind of check someone's statements about something regarding to an aquarium, that's not the easy route, right? It's harder to just kind of put your foot down and say, I don't think so. And for sure, almost anything you read online, or even if you hear at the fish store, you want to verify with multiple sources, right? Like I have a pretty good memory. I write basically a book report on reef builders twice a day, and I still have a huge library of books that I fall back on for reference. But this convenient information spreads faster than good, hard, impractical truths is something that we've all seen many, many times. I'm sure many folks have heard, oh, you have red bugs on your acros, okay, get a dragon-faced pipefish. But if you use just a little bit of critical thought, like why would a pipefish run around looking for these tiny, probably slightly toxic, little morsels of food when they have like a micro ecosystem of actual copepods and amphipods and mysis to eat? Which one would you eat if you were a pipefish, right? I remember someone offering that in a forum as a possible solution. And over time, it has spread and spread and spread. And I'll be at aquarium stores and I'll just overhear it. Someone saying, oh, I have, red bugs on my acros. And someone on the staff just, directly telling them, oh, get a dragon-faced pipefish, as if that will actually solve your problems. But also, if you do a Google search, you'll find that there's been a few aquarists who have tried to put like 10 dragon-faced pipefish in a small tank with just one colony and saw like virtually no predation of that. And I feel similarly about flatworms, not just coral flatworms, but the red planaria that are in your aquariums. I still remember this one thread where someone offered, hey, maybe springerite damselfish will eat them, right? I have a tank with 8 springerite damselfish, and there's plenty of flatworms in that tank. If they're starving, okay, maybe they might pick at one here and there, but I'd like to take care of my fish and I feed them good food. Would you want to eat a toxic flatworm or nice bits of, meaty frozen seafood? Right? And once again, if you just use a little bit of critical thought, I'm really inspired by Albert Einstein and his thought experiments. These are experiments you can just hold in your mind. You don't need to go out into the world and do something really elaborate. But thought experiments will help you kind of cut through some of this noise, right? And those are just a couple examples of convenient things that people think that they know. And I worked at aquarium stores for a long time, and it's just so much easier to just, instead of giving someone a 12-step program to, cleansing their tanks of this, that, or the other, it's just easier. And it's way more lucrative to just say, oh yeah, buy a few of these, buy a few of those. If it doesn't work, we'll try some, flatworm exit or this other thing. But I really feel that way too much of what we think we know in the broader aquarium hobby is fueled by just commercial interest. And it's not malicious. It's just convenient. It's so much easier to say, okay, here we have a product for you. We have a silver bullet for you. And, I'm not saying you should do this across the board. GFO does remove phosphates. Algae scrubbers can make a difference. But if you look at the whole problem holistically and think about who's giving out some of this information or where some of this information first started coming from, if there's a dollar attached to it, you might just re-examine some of that knowledge.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, goes back to what I was saying about reading a bunch of articles written by folks like Rob Toonen, Craig Bingman, Randy Holmes Farley. Like, they're not really trying to sell me anything, right? And now it's like, okay, I've got a problem in my tank, and I go on YouTube, and it's somebody trying to sell me something or peddle something, and I am a cynic. I go, okay, well, wait a minute. I know they're probably trying to help me, but I can't ignore the fact that, they're, telling me there's a product to solve all my problems. But it also goes back to, with the convenient answers, being able to change your mind, right? I mean, I think we all need that a little more in this world, period. I think we all try to have these sticking points, and that's the hill I'm going to die on. Did you guys go to Sanjay's talk about nitrates yesterday? So I'm a diehard, and he's going to hate me for saying this, refugium guy, because he likes to call it caulerpa scrubber, but that just doesn't roll off the tongue. And I've done carbon dosing. I have an old Inland Aquatics turf scrubber. Am I making the mic bounce? Sorry. I like methodologies, and I'm always looking for something better, and the 20 plus years I've done this. And for some reason, when I give up and just throw a bunch of Kato, back in the day it was caulerpa, and my son throw light over it, my tank just locks in. Like, everything just kind of starts to settle in, and life flourishes. And of course, I've always just been convinced that it's, being a nutrient export. It's also being a refuge, right, for some microorganisms. So I just stick with it. And he's not a big algae growing guy, and he's not into substrates, and I am. And I'm like, look, like, when I do this recipe for me, I'm not saying everybody in the world needs to do it. It works for me. That said, I sat there and listened to Sanjay talk, and when he did that mathematical breakdown about how much nitrate his macroalgae scrubber is removing, I just kind of went, because now I've got a problem in my brain. Because I like my tank, I like the way I run it, it works for me, but the reason I thought it was working may not be the reason anymore. And so I'm sitting there going, well, it doesn't look like I'm exporting a hell of a lot of phosphates and nitrates if his answers are true. But I can't reconcile that my tank does better when I do use a refugium, right? So, that was the bar conversation for me. I wanted to pick everybody's brain. Like, why do you think that is? Like, what is going on with this, So I think that's the other side of it is I wasn't about to just vehemently disagree with Sanjay and argue with him and tell him his math is wrong and I'm going to die on this hill. It was like, okay, now I got to figure out why refugiums work for me, and that, and now I kind of want to remove it again, and see, do I go downhill again? Maybe the tank would always fall into that stasis of things starting to roll and lock in together, regardless of whether I threw that algae in the sump and lit it. Maybe it was a timing thing. It's just, I don't know. So, but that goes back to that convenient answer thing, right? I'm sure if you pull up a debate on a Reef forum about refugiums, you see that debate kind of it's this or that, and there's nothing in between. So
I have a slightly different perspective on algae scrubbers, and this is not implicitly stated in the Triton method, but I like the math that Sanjay demonstrated in his talk. I always actually looked at an algae scrubber more as a CO2 scrubber, right? So it's pulling out a lot of CO2 depending on how you run it. And it's also phytoremediation. You know, you can't put a chemical media for every bad thing that you want to remove for your aquarium. But just the very fact of the biomass growing from your algae scrubber is just inherently absorbing heavy metals and toxins that we haven't even become familiar with. You know, so that's one of the ways that I look at an algae scrubber. And so I was running a big old barrel of spinning chetamorpha, and it was really, really cool. And I enjoyed it very much. But as it got a lot bigger, it started to pull out too much of those trace elements, and then it was competing with the corals. And then I started dosing a little bit more iron and keto grow and other things for it, but my nitrates and phosphates are 0.00 according to many test kits. And I started looking at my very beautiful barrel of spinning chetamorpha that I love very much, and I'm like, I'm not here for that. I'm here for the coral. So I don't think that this is useful for me. But no, he's totally right, though, about there's a few things that, once you've been reefing for a long time or keeping in freshwater aquariums, there's a couple habits that work for the way that you keep an aquarium. And one of the reasons I, push back against mechanical or, just kind of automatic, I need an RO unit, I need an algae scrubber, I need a refugium, is I worked in aquarium stores for a long time, and there was never someone who came into the tank having problems because they hadn't done enough. They were always doing something. And you see that today more than ever in our aquariums, is people are overdoing it. No one ever lost corals because they didn't dose. That just won't happen. The corals will slow down. They might not be quite as colorful, but man, I can't think of one parameter besides salinity that is, really going to harm your corals, your fish, if you underdo it, right? We've talked a lot about this through this weekend, as you see build threads and build videos where a man is very excited about all the toys and all the bells and whistles, and they've got union, ball valve, union, ball valve, and it's like multiple layers, and you're like, what are you doing? You're really just not focusing on the art of reef keeping. And if you think about this, in every problem that you've ever had, every problem that I've ever had, I have to use every ounce of self-restraint not to overcorrect, right? Whether your alkalinity, your calcium came down, you want to bring it back up fast. You start playing around with a new trace element, and you see that it's having an impact on your tank. You want to do it more, and it's just so hard to just tell yourself, okay, let me not chase any numbers. I'm just going to add a little bit, and over a long period of time, my coral's going to be happier. But I can't really think of any solid examples where you're going to get in trouble from underdoing it, right? I mean, I'm telling you, this is one of the biggest things, and you see all these threads and all these, it's everywhere now. Social media, videos, articles, maybe some podcasts too, just building and building and building and building, and they're not just letting their corals grow.
Yeah, and I'll confess to two things I'm horribly guilty of, and so I can preach all day long, but I do this all the freaking time. One is, I was saying to him once that in the time that I've been reef keeping, I've never discovered a magic elixir, right? Like, beyond dosing calcium and alkalinity type supplements, I would say, or maybe the exception being amino acids. I have seen, some beneficial stuff with amino acids, which actually started back when we had red bugs and we didn't have a way to get rid of them yet with Interceptor. There was a definite tangible difference that adding the amino acids allowed the corals to exist for some time longer with the red bugs. You could literally see the turnaround. So that was maybe the best magic elixir, and I still do believe in aminos, but let's just take that one off the table as the edge case. To this day, I still hope for a magic bottle, right? Like when that friend you really trust in the hobby is like, man, I started dosing this new trace element, or I started dosing barium, and holy crap, man, my corals look so much better. Like, you want him to be right? You're going to go online, you're going to buy that bottle, and you're just, it never ends up working out for me. I don't know about you guys, but I still just dose calcium alkalinity. I still dabble with aminos kind of on and off, so that's one mistake I always make in terms of overdoing it.
I don't want to get preachy.
No, but
so I want to give you an example of how I screwed up within the last year. I was dosing a very potent trace element that was made up mostly of metals, and I was just seeing fantastic results, just incredible colors.
And guess who bought it next, right?
And there's a 2-week dosing period where you're trying to bring the levels up. These are all really esoteric trace elements. It's not practical to set an ICP test every single day to figure out where you're at. And I was just happy. My corals are doing great. I'm just seeing so much stuff perk up. And so, but after 2 weeks, I kept doing the saturation dose of the early days, and corals are looking amazing and they're getting super colorful. And then about the third week, after I was like, oh, all right, I should probably cool it a little bit, I started losing some corals, and I got super freaking lucky because it was isolated to the very thinnest branched acroporas, which grow really fast, but it was very, very strange. It was a very small subgroup of acros that let me know they weren't doing okay. They were crazy colored. Zeovit tanks are like rarer, so they may be fading from your memory, but some of those corals were looking like that. And man, I had written off a few corals because they were just looking so bright and pale, and just not like too bright and too light colored. And I got really, really lucky because I had stopped doing the saturation dose before I saw these symptoms. But man, I was not happy with myself because I knew I wasn't hitting the numbers. But I just want you to know, we're not like magical reefers. We're human beings, and we're still always making mistakes. And it takes a lot of just, I don't even know how to say it, but you really have to be mindful of overdoing it no matter how long you've been in the reef aquarium hobby. And like I said, you will never get in trouble by doing a quarter dose of whatever is being prescribed, or just less. So yeah, I just wanted to share that example. And I was lucky that it was a fast growing dragon type deep water acros. I didn't lose any full colonies. But I had a beautiful orange dragon, if any of you guys are familiar with that. And I was just super lucky that there was, a small piece on the original mariculture base, and then the big piece. And the big piece, pretty much all died out. And the small piece that was actually isolated just never succumbed to this mistake that I did like several months ago, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So this is, we're not over here. Even the lessons that we've learned, we have to relearn them.
Well, the other one that I could tell everybody else to not do this, and I do it all the time, is if I find a problem, if I have a little bit of cyano, if I have a little patch of algae, or maybe I see a vermitid snail in my tank, I go thermonuclear option, right? I have to solve this now, and it has to be solved within a couple of weeks instead of just letting it be, and maybe it'll sort itself out. It's like my brain is wired to always try to fix or solve something that's wrong with the tank. But at the end of the day, it's a little patch of cyano isn't the end of the world, Is it Instagram worthy at that point? Probably not. But, I'm pretty sure some of those Instagram people are stirring up their sand bed and just, letting the dust settle and like, okay, here's my tank, and I'd love to see what their tank looks like when they come back from vacation, right? And I am so guilty of this. I just need to not react to the one thing that's wrong with my tank. I was complimenting somebody's tank here this weekend, and the guy was like, thank you. All I see when I look at my tank is everything that's wrong with it. It was actually Steve from the Georgia Aquarium. I was complimenting how much better the coral reef has become over the many years that I've lived here. And I think he was the one that said, when I look at that tank, I just see everything I need to fix, or, whereas, the people that go to the Georgia Aquarium are standing in front of it and going, holy crap, this is amazing, right? But I see that in the hobby too, right? Somebody might come over. I was nervous for him to come crash on my house because I'm like, oh man, my tank sucks right now. My sand bed's got some funky algae, turfy algae growing on it. I'm trying to figure out, But maybe he kept it to himself. Maybe he thought my tank was terrible and he just didn't tell me. But it's you're always going to see the thing you need to fix, and then you're going to focus on that, and then maybe you go and fix that, and now you made everything 10 times worse, when everybody else is probably perfectly fine with that tiny patch of cyanide when they come over to your house. And so maybe, maybe don't go nuclear and then create a cascading effect that could be 10 times worse, so.
He is totally right about longtime reefers should be only seeing the flaws in their tank. Not only, but if you can have a beautiful reef tank, and if there's just one coral that that's struggling, or there's a persistent patch of just something you don't want there, it's more front and center in your mind than it should be. And if somebody looks at your tank, they'll never see it. All right, here's a perfect example. I fragged out some red dragon and kind of a blue tip dragon not too long ago, and I had the rock out of water for good like 15-20 minutes. And these are again thin branched acros, don't like to be out of water nearly as much as some of the thicker boys, right? And I had it out of water for quite a bit, and right before reef stock, I noticed that blue tip acro was receding inside. Not super fast, it wasn't super nasty, and the knee-jerk reaction for anyone nowadays would be, take it out, we got to frag it out, we got to reset it, we got to restart it. And I've actually weathered some of these things, and it takes, again, so much self-control to be like, what, this is not RTN. This is just some localized temporary stress because I had it out of water for too long, or you did something, right? And I had the reef stock after party and had a ton of visitors to the studio for the first time ever, right? Never had that many people. Not a single person saw it. It was right there in the front of the glass. No one saw it. And you know what? That patch didn't continue. It didn't continue to recede, and I just let it go. And so it's really true that we are dogging our own aquariums and just loving on other people's tanks because you don't know, some of the things that they might be challenged by or suffering from. And there's definitely an aspect of social media nowadays where everyone is giving you a sanitized representation of whatever it is that they're doing. And you guys all know this. You know this in your bones. But when you're scrolling Instagram and you see, those cars that you're into, or somebody's fruit from their garden or their reef tank, you're like, man, why does my tank look like this? And you know this inherently. But man, I'll tell you what, I was subscribed to or following a bunch of different coral pages on Facebook, and I'd see all these crazy colors. I'm like, man, like my corals look really good, but these colors are kind of crazy. I'm like, I know about yellow orange filters. I've been there since the beginning. I got a giant lineup of them. And it was like months of looking at these other people's pictures, that sanitized online. Just one day I was like, let me go grab my glasses, because I almost never grab my glasses. Now we looked at my corals. I was like, oh my God, my corals look even better than theirs. And so you really have to be mindful. There's a lot of psychology involved. I can't describe it, but especially when I started out with the Reef Builder Studio, I felt the need to always wipe down the class, to always have crystal clear water, to never show any algae or aptasia or whatever, is going on. And several of us are actually making a concerted effort to show those flaws, show you a beautiful, like perfect reef tank. And then you zoom in, you enhance. You show, like, hey, look, I got a patch of detritus right here. I got cyano that never goes away in this spot. I got aptasia under this rock that I could never get to. And so this is something I want you to really take away from this talk, is like, your tank is much nicer looking than you think, and those tanks that you see online, whether the freshwater or saltwater, or just everything is super sanitized, and it's not reality, so that is one of those things that it's weird, because it's like the beauty covers of aquariums. We've already talked about this in the 90s. The covers of beauty magazines making young girls feel bad about their body, and now social media is making us feel bad about everything about ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's fun to look at nice looking tanks. It's interesting that, even in my own habits, I would spend more time on Instagram than, say, a reef aquarium forum. And that wasn't just out of, I want to look at pretty tanks and stuff. The forums sometimes get, I don't know, it's
A lot of noise.
yeah, somebody asks a question on how to fix something, and that just spirals into an argument between two people, and and then you wonder if the guy actually got the help he needed. But it's funny. I'm sure, like you, I have other hobbies, and I am a hyper-focused person, so I can't spread my attention across things evenly. My wife hates that about me. So I will hyperfixate on one thing, and then I'll hyperfixate on the other thing. A doctor once told me that I must have had ADD or something as a kid, and this was before they had prescribed medications and treatments and stuff. And so it's like, maybe it's a coping mechanism. So the way that you avoid getting distracted is you just fixate on one thing. Anyway, more about me than you need to know, but. I'm happiest with my reef aquariums when I'm more fixated on my other hobbies, not because I'm ignoring it and so I'm not thinking about it, but when I'm busy really getting into figuring out how to play a song on the guitar. I love to go fly fishing, backpacking, so I start planning my trips and, how can I lighten my pack weight and this and that, and I just get fixated on, looking at maps. And then I'm walking by my tank. I'm like, that's a good looking tank, man. Oh man, that fish is doing really well. And it's because I haven't been on Instagram. I haven't been on the forums. I've been on other forums, right? I've been on fly fishing forums or guitar forums, but I took the attention elsewhere and I could just enjoy my tank for what it was. And when he was over at my house the other day, on Thursday, I kind of said that. I was like, sometimes when I'm not as focused on the hobby, I enjoy the tank more. I think that's why sometimes I disappear and crawl into a cave, because I don't really go to Macnas very often. I don't do a lot of the conferences and stuff like that. I'm sure when we started Reef Therapy, some people were like, who the hell is this guy sitting next to Jake, right? Because I don't really put myself out there much, but that I think is a way for me to enjoy the hobby more. And I'm not saying go crawl into a cave, but it's interesting if you can observe that in yourself, that when summertime hits and you want to be outside, and so your tank kind of just goes on autopilot, like just go look at your tank and see if you actually enjoy it more, in a less intensely focused way, right? Where you're just like it's the thing that rules your brain, right? It's living rent free in your brain, and you're worrying about the Valonia, and you're worrying about whether you have the best skimmer. It's just sometimes it's better to be a bit away from it and just enjoy it in that way. I think that's what we were sort of talking about in our podcast about coasting. Sometimes it's good to coast in the hobby. So
you have to learn how to do that, right? And he's absolutely right. You can't be reefing all the time. You have to learn to let some of these small flaws go and just kind of sit back and see, if that recession in that coral is going to proceed, or if that Valonia doesn't move, it doesn't grow, it doesn't expand, then who cares? Valonia is actually kind of cool looking, right? If you think about it. Aptasias also, like they're kind of neat. They're little, but if you're just always wired into it, you're not going to enjoy your tank as much. And I've actually had this conversation with a lot of locals and other aquarists that they're always talking on their tanks. But then I'll go over and check out their aquariums, and I'm like, what are you talking about, man? Your tank is amazing. You have some ideas of where you want to take it, but futzing with it all the time, that's just a recipe for burning yourself out. But the other aspect of social media that is robbing us is that sense of community. Aquarium clubs and just clubs in general, that used to be a place for us to get together, commune, get face to face. And, before we could all take a lot of pictures and a lot of video of our tanks, we did tank tours. We went and saw what other people are doing, and that's like the most enriching thing for your aquarium experience. Even if you know all the things, I know all the things, but I still call everyone and message everyone. Anytime I'm doing something new, I will pull like 10 to 12 different people. I just started dosing phosphate to my aquariums. Well, not just, like a few weeks ago, I hit up Richard because his tank has got a sweet spot of phosphates that other tanks wouldn't. So I was, pulling him to just understand a little bit more about the upper limits of phosphates, right? But when other people come to see your tank, they are going to have a different point of view And it's not so much about ego, but if you only see these criticisms of yourself and your own aquarium, and then just a few local guys or a dozen folks from a club that know what they're looking at see your tank and they're all tell you that you're doing amazing, it's going to push some of those self-hate out into the back of your mind. And so I feel like that's still something that we need to get back to, is visiting with each other like we're doing here at aquarium conferences, but going to see each other's aquariums. There is no substitution for seeing the aquariums in person, seeing the dimension. And for me, one thing I always love, and I'll never get bored of, is seeing how people get where they are. And I can consider different ways to tweak some of my different tanks, but you can talk all you want on a forum and show me all the pictures and shoot me over a video, and I'll have an idea of what you're talking about. But when you see it in person in real life, oh my God, it's going to inform like what you should be doing with your lighting, what you should be doing with your water flow. And I feel like comparing notes with a small community of your local area, that is the epitome of reefing. That's something we've almost completely lost. The internet and the pictures and the social is pushing us apart, because I'm sure some of us here have relatives that we know exactly what they ate yesterday and have been up to for weeks, and you haven't talked to them on the phone in a year. But you know exactly what they're up to. So this is one of those things I'm really trying to push folks to go visit each other's aquariums. So yeah, we have a lot of get off our lawn moments.
Yeah.
We try to limit it down, and so we want to kind of end on a note of some of the cool things that are happening. It's a double-edged sword, that the hobby has grown so much that the information is not kind of being preserved and cherished as much as some of the old guard would like. But there's a lot of creativity out there. There's so many more people that are trying out different things. I am not a fan of people fetishizing their pH and keeping their pH super high and keeping it super narrow. And the way they talk about it, like that's the achievement. I talk to plenty of reefers who talk to me about pH, and they don't say anything about what their corals are doing or the coralline algae is doing. And it's kind of this blind, beyond number chasing at this point. But you know what? At the end of the day, a lot more reef tanks are running more alkaline than they did a few years ago. And so you got to take the good with the bad. And oh man, one of the coolest things that I've seen recently that I'm keeping on my desk, because that's just kind of low-key blowing my mind every time I see it, is we've had access to 3D printers for a good solid decade now. People are printing all kinds of goofy things for their tanks. But one thing that I love is that little carrier that you can put a frag plug in, and then that carrier goes into a container. That coral never touches the edges. Do you know how long we have struggled with trying to protect our corals and cushion them from point A to point B? And I got this one frag at Reef Stock that came in this carrier that went into a lid, reusable plastic, and I'm just like, it's still open. It's still open in the jar. I can literally pull the carrier and put the coral in the tank without ever touching it. Not that I don't like touching corals, but that kind of innovation. So simple. That coral never has to bump up against anything. It's never going to be exposed to where a little bit of algae can grow. We're spending so much on corals these days that, yeah, you can throw a little $1 3D print to give it like this perfect, basically a car seat for like a small child. And it's amazing to see you feel it's transported this way, because, there are a lot of very soft, delicate tissues covering very sharp, delicate skeleton. And it's just really easy to poke them and break them. So, yeah, there's a lot of cool things happening. I love the realization of certain fully fledged aquarium products that came from the DIY community. You guys see a Trident or an Alcatronic, and you see a fully fledged machine. And I remember the guys who originally started making those in their garages or basements. Both of those machines started as DIY projects. And so it's really cool that the hobby's gotten so large that it's going in every direction.
Yeah, and I mean, not to beat the social media horse to death, but in the context of what he's talking about, I heard an interesting quote of, when there's something to solve, right? A beginner sees a million possible solutions, an expert only sees a few. And I mean, take beginner and expert out of it, but sometimes it's the guy who's not arguing on all the forums, and he's like, we've never heard of him, right? He's, or her, sorry, but just a reefing hobbyist out in some corner, just not really, doesn't want to get on the computer and argue with somebody, that may be doing something really freaking brilliant. And then one day, a buddy goes over and goes, holy crap, and then that becomes now a new step forward in the hobby. Whereas the people that are yelling, get off my lawn, like, we might not come up with something like that, right? Because we've tried so many things and failed. We're like, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. That's not going to work, right? So again, going back to the DIY, sometimes it's some hobbyist that comes up with something that then becomes the next product versus the companies themselves, right? That have their own R&D happening. So that's, I think, the fun part of interacting and communicating with people beyond just a 10-second video, because I've been surprised by that sometimes, going over to somebody's house and, they've just rigged up some random crazy thing that I've never even thought of on how to solve a problem. I wish I could remember something. There was a conversation just this weekend where I was just bringing up this thing, and somebody was like, well, why didn't you just try this? And I was like, God, I'm not going to cuss, but, I was like, I was pissed at myself because it was just like I had a blind spot, right? And this person just saw right through it and said, well, you could have solved it this way. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the conversation was. If it comes back to me, I'll bring it up. But that's where I think the innovation in the hobby happens and that's why I think things like this are, fun. And having dinner or having coffee with somebody that you met at the conference and just chatting things over, I think that's where some of the best ideas come from, or you have your mind changed about something. I'm seriously thinking about pulling the Kato out of my sump and just seeing what happens now because Sanjay wrecked my brain yesterday, so.
We just heard some, a cool trick. And I know for a lot of you guys that do actually grow Ketomorpha scrubber, the classic way is to put it in the tank, put some light on top, but you already know what happens there, right? You get a lot of algae growing on top, you get a lot of cyano growing on top, and it just starts dying down from the bottom. And one person in this room, he was telling me that he was lighting up from the bottom. And that allows the macroalgae to be on the top and grow downwards in a much more holistic way. And I'm, looking forward to learning a little bit more about this technique. But yeah, I've lit macroalgae from the top with submersible lights from the sides, and it never occurred to me. It's like, hey, maybe there's this awesome benefit to putting the lights underneath, because then the macroalgae can grow down and it's not going to get all scuzzy on the top. So that's super important to keep your
So I remember what it was. I was moving from a new tank, or from an old tank to a new tank, right? Different aquascape. You can never get the rocks back together. I had all these mature colonies, right? I'm like, I'm never going to get all these things to fit in this new tank right. So I said, I'm just going to reset, right? Take a frag of every coral and just regrow the coral so I can do the aquascape how I want. But I was complaining, like, now I've started over. Now I got to wait for everything to grow. And somebody here said, well, why didn't you take that acro, instead of one frag, you took like 10 frags and planted them in one area, because that would have turned into a colony much quicker. And I just stared at him like...
it was rich.
Was it rich?
For both of those.
And I was just like, I didn't want to say thank you. I wanted to cuss him out because I was so mad, right? I was just like, what? Yeah. I mean, seriously, I took one frag of a Jason Flox acro and I was like, okay, I'm going to plant that here. And, now it can grow with the different flow and the different light in my new tank, instead of maybe planting like 20 frags of the same coral in that spot. And it would have been a colony a lot quicker, right? I'm an idiot, but now I know, but that eureka moment wouldn't have transpired if I wasn't here just chatting with him. It doesn't help me now. But my next tank, if I ever have another tank, I'm definitely going to do that. So
yeah, no, I think it was really fun. I think we, we're in a fog when we started, and definitely warmed up to our, typical reef therapy tone and style. We really want to thank Masna for having us here and giving us the opportunity to do this live. We're doing it live,
yeah,
with you guys, and it's been fun to again commune with you all. We've both already learned stuff this weekend that we're going to apply to our own aquariums, and I hope you guys are enjoying the show. I want to thank everybody for coming out.